Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward. My name is Jason. I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. We are currently very early on in Season 5. We are covering the 1982 and 1983 novelizations this season. This week, we are on the April 1982 book, Doctor Who and Warrior's Gate. We are in the middle of a run of Season 18 stories, the first 3 of which were novelized in publication order. That was last week, Episode 66, State of Decay. This week, Episode 67, Warrior's Gate. And then next week, Episode 68, The Keeper of Traken. This season will run through the November 1983 paperback release of Doctor Who and the Five Doctors. Coming up this season, we have several very popular returning guests. Some of the guests behind my top 5 most downloaded episodes of all time are going to be back this season. We have several authors of Doctor Who books. We have authors from Black Archive books. I see a best-selling author coming up down the line this season, which covers the 1982 and 1983 books. We are also going to have our first novelization that is so epic that it is going to require 2 full episodes to discuss. That's right. There is going to be one book that will encompass back-to-back weeks' worth of releases dedicated to the one book and its parent TV serial. I will not tease which one. However, we have some very exciting things coming up over the next few months. So do not miss out. Episodes come out every Sunday morning at about 7 a.m. Greenwich Meridian time. And you can also find them on your podcatcher of choice. We were originally the product of Anchor, a division of Spotify. The Anchor identity is being rolled into Spotify, and I will doubtless have to change my URLs pretty soon. Taking a look at mail. I love getting mail. You can reach me at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature at gmail.com. This week, we've heard from Conrad. You've heard Conrad on the show several times before. You might have heard his voice on Big Finish audios. He's also a regular co-host / panelist on the Trap One podcast. Conrad is a great friend of mine and a great friend of the program. Conrad wants us to know that he listens to the show every Sunday as part of his regular ritual, and as he listens to the show, he is wearing his crown from 20 Questions. Now, there is a new game of 20 Questions with this week's guest. I will not spoil for you as to whether or not this week's guest has taken away Conrad's crown. You'll have to listen to the end of the episode to find out. This week, we are joined by Adam Clegg of the Real McCoy podcast. Adam has been on the show before. If you look back in your archives, he joined us for episode 33, The Brain of Morbius. That, of course, was quite some time ago, so I'm looking forward to finding out what he's up to. And I'm looking forward to what he thinks of Season 18, the JNT / Christopher H. Bidmead era of the show. We know that he loves the Philip Hinchcliffe era, of course, as do I. But in a few moments, Adam will talk to us all about Doctor Who and Warrior's Gate. One last prefatory matter. I am calling for submissions for my upcoming episode about the Five Doctors. If you've been with me since episode 50, the War Games, for a special story like that, I invited my audience members to chime in with audio recordings, narrating their memories of the book and of the TV story, and I'd like to do the same thing for the Five Doctors. An audio recording of 3 to 5 minutes in length would be best, but of course be as creative as you want. Talk to me about the Five Doctors. Talk to me about the Five Doctors novelization. Talk to me about when and how you first saw it. And you can send those to by email, Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature at gmail, or you can send it to me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels. That's DR Who Novels. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you. That episode is coming out at the end of the season. That is the November 1983 novelization and the last episode of Doctor Who Literature Podcast Season 5. So you have a little bit of time to get to work, and I'm really interested to hear what you guys are going to come up with. Coming up next, on the other side of the break, Adam Clegg, Season 18, Doctor Who, Warrior's Gate. Let's get to it.
You are invited on an adventure across all of time and space, in a completely random order. It's the Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. Jump in the TARDIS with your hosts,
Eric Gulbranson,
Asad Kheshki,
and
Matthew Kressel.
explore Doctor Who TV stories, audio adventures, and books, both novels and non-fiction. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. It's the entire Whoniverse on shuffle. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast is a member of the Direction Point Network and is available about once a month wherever you find your podcasts. You are listening to the Doctor Who Literature podcast.
All right, Adam Clegg,
Excellent.
welcome back to Doctor Who Literature.
Thanks. Thank you for having me back, and thank you for having me back for one of my favourite stories. So I'm looking forward to this.
I'll tell you, the very first time that I saw Warrior's Gate would have been late 1985. Now, of course, as you know, in the States, PBS was showing the Doctors out of order, so I had access to like 5 different PBS stations in the New York City suburbs, and they all had a different Doctor on. This was the very first time that I'd seen Warrior's Gate, but my local station had just moved the show from 7 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. And I'm 12 years old, and I'm only allowed to stay up that late on Fridays, so I could only watch season 18 on Fridays. So all I saw of Warrior's Gate was part 1, and I found it very, very confusing, and I had nightmares about the ending with Birok going through the mirror. But it was 2 years before I saw the whole thing. So for the longest time, all I had was the book to keep me company. Now, this is one of those stories that gets better as I get older, and I'll be talking about this on the other side of the program when I'm reviewing the book. This is the work of a 27-year-old man, and the level of genius that he puts into the script is well beyond my capabilities, and I'm nearly twice the age now that Stephen Gallagher was when he wrote it. So I am just in absolute awe of Warrior's Gate, and I'm glad to hear that you are too. What's your experience with the story?
Well, I first experienced it on VHS. It would have been mid-90s. They released the E-Space trilogy, and I picked it up. And I hadn't really seen much series by this point. I think I'd seen Leisure Hive. I don't think I'd seen Logopolis by this stage or Keep of Traken. But I love the whole set. And like I said, Series 18 is one of my all-time favorite eras of the show. But yeah, Warrior's Gate, I just loved it instantly, because I think for me, it's kind of one of those examples of this little subgenre in Doctor Who, which is the Doctor in really weird spaces. So you get like this, Mind Robber, Ghostlight. I kind of feel you don't get it so much in the modern series, but I think you can make maybe a case for Heaven Sent. Certainly sections of It Takes You Away, definitely. And yeah, it's one of those stories that the logic is interesting, but it just draws you in. It's a very visual story. People often joke with Doctor Who that, you know, it looks cheap and everything, etc., etc. But Doctor Who is in many ways a television experience, first and foremost, because it is such a visual show. It's a visual show from the moment Ian and Barbara first walk into this blue police box, end up in this otherworldly space. And this is so visual. And I mean, it's one of those stories that as I've gotten older, I've appreciated it, but I also appreciated how lucky we are that it is so good, given the production of it was nightmarish by all accounts.
Not to put too fine a point on it, yes.
And yeah, so there was a lot of, let's say, tension during a time when it was fairly tense behind the scenes anyway. But it works. It's one of those few cases. Sometimes something like that, you know, you get that kind of tension and something just doesn't work. And other times something this good comes out of it. And Yeah, because you and I were both at Galley last year. Stephen Gallagher was there, and he chatted a bit about this, and it was interesting for me because it was actually one of his earliest TV works, I think. Like he's had a really like long and good career in British TV since, but this was very early on, and he said there was a lot of changes made, but he wasn't one of those writers who was like they changed it, how dare they? He was like, no, it's fine. Very much a professional approach, I thought.
I was in the coffee clutch with him. That's where you have 8 or 10 guests sitting around a boardroom table on the convention level of the LAX Marriott. So I was there. David Barsky, who's a frequent contributor to this program, was there. And I'm sure Stephen said the same thing at several different panels over the course of that weekend. But what struck me is that he was comparing his experience with Christopher H. Bidmead script editing this story versus comparing the experience of Eric Sayward script editing Terminus 2 years later. He said that he still considers it his story, even though Bidmead made some changes, because he and Bidmead were on the same level and they were thinking of the same things. So he considers the work his own, whereas what happened with Terminus is quite a different story.
Yes, yeah, it's yes, that I understand that as well. I mean, I don't particularly like Terminus. I haven't watched it for a while. I definitely, will always go to Warriors Gate if between the two of them. But yeah, some writers, particularly during that kind of early to mid 80s, just don't have any luck with productions at all. Like really disastrous, in fact. But yeah, I'm just so glad that Warriors Gate comes out so strongly.
I want to backtrack a moment because you made a very interesting statement about the new series. And I guess the phrase that I'll use is liminal spaces, because I've seen that used a lot. There are probably a few more new series stories that are set in that kind of, null space or virtual space. Looking a little bit further back in time than Heaven Sent, I think we could put Amy's Choice in that category. That's a dream episode where the Doctor is being stalked by an antagonist that has a connection to him, and they're never quite sure when they're in the real world versus not. And along the same lines, going back to Amy, The Girl Who Waited also takes place in an unusual space where the rules of physics and the rules of time have been completely inverted. So those are two Amy stories with similar titles that it's easy to confuse, but those are also stories that take place in a world where the Doctor is on the back foot and where time is running in the wrong direction, and where the space that they're in, as much the antagonist of the story as a terrific actor like Clifford Rose, who's playing the human villain. He's not even the main focus of the story because there's so much else going on. And I think if we were to brainstorm, we could probably think of other new series adventures that have the same kind of vibe. There was one, I think it was Can You Hear Me? One of the middle season Jodie Whittaker stories, which also takes place in a space where the Doctor is not in control. Very interesting type of storytelling.
Yeah, no, that's actually a fairly good point. When it's interesting you mentioned The Girl Who Waited, because when I was thinking about these kind of stories, I did half consider that, and I think you're right actually. And again, with Amy's Choice, it actually weirdly didn't pop into my head. I guess what's different now is that things like Ghost Light, Warriors Gate, and the Mind Robber, those are like my 3 examples. They were generally considered, when I was started being a fan in the 90s, those were considered like the weird ones, and I don't think people tend to think of The Girl Who Waited or Amy's Choice as or even Heaven Sent again as weird, and maybe it's because we're more used to those sort of stories. There's an audience now that's more used to that kind of weirdness, whether maybe when the classic series was first running, using that kind of space felt newer in a way. I'm not sure, but it is a favorite subgenre. I like it when Doctor Who goes to weird places and oddities, and I'm one of those people who I'm like, does the plot make sense? No, but I like the vibes. So if it's weird enough, I will just go along with it.
You also raised an interesting point, and let's talk about this for a few minutes. You talk about the production nightmare behind Warriors Gate. it is interesting to note that when you're talking about the classic series stories between 63 and 89, which take place in these liminal spaces, there's that phrase again, it's always because there's some crisis in the production team. So, for example, Celestial Toymaker, you have the outgoing producer is trying to get William Hartnell fired. When he's not able to get Hartnell fired, he quits the series and is replaced by a different producer halfway through the production block. You then have the situation where you're on a multiple drafts of a story by multiple writers. So the original idea for Celestial Toymaker has little relation to what gets filmed. William Hartnell is only in the first 10 minutes of part 1 and the last 10 minutes of part 4. So that's a nightmarish space in a story that is made under nightmarish circumstances, and its reputation and fandom has taken a pretty big hit. Mind Robber is created because part 6 of The Dominators was deemed too boring to air, so they cut that down to a 5-part story. But now they have a 4-part story, Mind Robber, that suddenly needs a 1-episode prologue. Derek Sherwin writes the thing probably on the back of a cocktail napkin in the 10 minutes before they go into the studio, and it's just filmed either on the TARDIS set or against a white backdrop, a cyclorama, if you will. And Warrior's Gate is almost visually the same thing as Mind Robber because it takes place, for the most part, in a white space. Now, it doesn't have the white robot, and it's not made as quickly or as haphazardly as Mind Robber, but do you want to talk about what happened with director Paul Joyce during the making of this story? Because I think it's going to be very informative when we talk about Warrior's Gate, and we'll get into the differences between the book and the TV episode, but I think it'll be informative for you to tell us just why the making of the TV episode was such a disaster.
Oh, absolutely. Though I do just want to quickly say how unusual for you to mention the Dominators on this podcast. But
that's a really good point. I'm sure that Fraser is going to weigh in, but I think this may be the very first time that I've talked about the Dominators on Doctor Who literature. Hi, Fraser.
It's sort of a rarely mentioned story. But yeah, well, I think Paul Joyce basically he was, JNT was very keen on bringing new directors. Which is no bad thing because Doctor Who relies on new blood coming in both on screen and behind the scenes. And Paul Joyce, I believe, had done 1 or 2 things for the BBC. I don't know his exact career, but I think JNT had liked it and brought him in. But of course, the thing is, Paul Joyce came in wanting to make a film. I mean, he talks about that on the making of. He had a huge filmic kind of vision, and he immediately runs into trouble because he starts filming. There's that one shot, I think it's in the first episode, where it scans along the spaceship, and it's a lovely shot. But he includes the ceiling, the studio ceiling with the lights on. Now this upsets the lighting technicians, and there's a whole hoo-ha about that. And basically, it seems like obviously Doctor Who is not a film, and it particularly back then, even now, it's made always under quite tight conditions, and especially back then, if you know that the BBC's filming schedule, it's very tight. You get so many days of filming, you get so many hours in the studio. If you go past 10 o'clock, I think it's 10 o'clock, you get charged extreme amounts of overtime. Or somebody from the electricians union might just turn off the lights, who can tell? And basically, you have to work within the system. You can do great work within the system, but you kind of have to respect it because you're part of a team. Paul Joyce is very much like, no, I'm the director. This does not go down well. I mean, one of the fascinating things about the making of documentary for this is he's really rude about Barry Letts. Like he's really dismissive of Barry Letts, which is so unusual because people generally, people love Barry Letts. Anyone else talks about him, they wonder. He's like, Barry. I told Barry the future film of TV was film, and he didn't believe me or something like that. He's like, it's not theatre, it's film or something. And he's really like, he obviously did not like Barry Letts at all. And it's funny because I've read things since where it's things like he didn't even bother doing a I can't think of his actor, but all directors had to do like a camera movement plan essentially, because with the setup of how it was shot, cameras would move around while the scenes were happening, and they'd have to make sure like they wouldn't get tangled, the cables wouldn't get caught up. He didn't bother doing that, so Graham Harper had to basically sit down and do the plan. The rumor is about the story is that Graham Harper, who was, I believe, production assistant also on this, had to direct a lot of it, because Paul Joyce would occasionally walk out, or I believe John Nathan Turner fired him at one point, but then he came back 10 minutes later when John Nathan Turner was like, no one else knows what's supposed to be happening. Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's worth reading interviews with him. Like, Paul Joyce has never, even for a moment, gone, actually, maybe I was working in a system that wasn't ready for that. And I at the end of the day, obviously everyone wants to create great Doctor Who, but at the end of the day, you have to get X amount of minutes in a can, or there's nothing going to be shown on TV. I don't think he ever quite accepted that, but it worked. It miraculously, what got to screen was good.
Those are some really interesting points you bring up. So, I mean, when you're talking about Barry Letts was a very innovative director for his time, and he was not afraid to fire a director who couldn't play within the bounds of the system. I mean, we know now from the Season 8 Blu-ray that he fired Timothy Coombe from ever working on Doctor Who again after what happened with Mind of Evil, where Coombe didn't get enough coverage of the soldiers' faces during the outdoor battle scene in episode 5/episode 6. So Barry Letts was a director himself, and he would get rid of you if you couldn't play within the rules. JNT must have been aware of what happened during season 17 of the classic series with Nightmare of Eden and Alan Bromley, who got fired the last night in the studio because he could not control his actors. But Bromley was old-fashioned and stodgy, and he was kind of a dinosaur. I think it was his last work as a director. Whereas Paul Joyce is a young Turk. Paul Joyce, and this is my recollection from having read the Blu-ray Warriors Gate production notes, Joyce wanted to do the thing basically single camera, which is, of course, how we do movies now, but you can't do single camera on a 5-camera setup when you only have 2.5 hours in studio and you're making this thing over 4 or 6 nights. It's just not possible to get 90 minutes of television that way. So at the same time, this is the second time in the making of season 18 where a director basically gets sacked by JNT because he's being too creative for his own good. We have Leisure Hive coming up here, or as we say in the States, Leisure Hive, in a couple of weeks. And that is a wonderful production. And I love Leisure Hive as a TV production to bits. But again, Lovett Bickford was not able to work within the bounds of the system, went incredibly over budget. So JNT must have had some PTSD. JNT, PTSD, that's probably too many acronyms for one episode of the show. But JNT must have had agita, to use an Italian word, from Leisure Hive, so that when he saw the same thing happening on Warriors Gate, he's like, this can't happen to me twice in a year. And this is why for the rest of JNT's run, you have Ron Jones and Peter Moffat coming back over and over again to do flat, visually inventive stories, because they could at least work on time and under budget.
I was gonna say that actually. There's a reason the Ron Jones and the Peter Moffats of the series, particularly up to the mid '80s, keep coming back. And as much as people aren't massively keen on their lack of visual style, shall we say, and there is a certain element of, yes, you're making up, but at the end of the day, you've got to get it in the can, because that's going out on Saturday at 6 p.m. whether it's finished or not. No one wants to show a repeat.
It is so frustrating to watch a Ron Jones episode because the camera never moves. You have these incredibly long static takes. There's no zooms. There's no tracking shots. I mean, the camera just sits there and the actors stand in front of it, and you have these 90-second takes, and you're just desperate visually for the camera to move and for something to happen. But it's sub-soap opera, and Doctor Who, of course, needs to have a little more visual flair than that. But you're right. I think Paul Joyce was fired from the set, and he went down to the bar knowing that they were going to call him because nobody else was going to be able to make his camera script work. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. I think the results speak for themselves. The results are incredible. But yeah, JNT, especially as a rookie producer with Barry Letts there to babysit him, this was not going to work. And that's why Paul Joyce never comes back to the show. And that's why for the most of the rest of JNT's era, you get these flat, visually non-inventive stories, and it kind of stays that way until Graham Harper and Alan Waring and some of the later directors come around. But this almost kills the JNT era before it got started, wouldn't you say?
Oh yes, yeah, because things went over budget, and I think he was reprimanded. And I think it's not like he's the only producer that happened to. Barry Letts himself a few times got his knuckles rapped for things running over. Actually, you mentioned Mind of Evil, and I think that happened there as well. Though, can I just say, Timothy Coombs seemed so sad about that. Like I watched the extras, and he was so sad that he never got to come back and do Doctor Who. I felt really bad for him, but yeah, it was definitely like he learned some very harsh lessons in that first year. And it's shame that his approach was to go, well, look, Peter Moffat's available. But there we go.
So we've talked about the negatives. Let's talk about how amazing Warriors Gate is from a production standpoint. Just start naming some things that you love about the visual look of the story.
Well,
and I bet you that my list is almost exactly the same.
I think I was going to say everything, but I love things like...
we'll take it as read, everything. But
obviously,
down a little bit further.
it's surprising. Obviously, you mentioned Mind Robber earlier, how effective a white void is. And it is a proper white void, and that works very well. The Thow's moving to it, that kind of after image effect, fairly simple by today's standards, but definitely effective. The Thou makeup, really good. Like, they don't come up often when we talk about good makeup in monster makeup in Doctor Who, but really nice, really nice. Obviously Tom Baker walking through black and white still photographs, as he moves through a mirror, just looks again lovely, wonderful. Not oddly enough, not described in the book. I was interested in how much of that would translate. They obviously talk about the white void and the stone gate in the middle of it, but I guess you can't really get across that kind of saying he walked through a black and white photo. Sounds ridiculous on page, but it works really well on screen. I think that there's so much, even things like it's a good the spaceship that the slavers have is a nice design. It's very kind of coming into that Alien style of like very practical. You feel like it is a place people work. There's so much. There's all the little touches of stuff people do as well. Like, I love that moment again, not in the book, but when Tom Baker overfills the wine glass and then just knocks it over with casual contempt. But yeah, it's one of those. I think it really is one of those Doctor Who stories where sometimes Doctor Who's fighting, particularly classic Who, sometimes it's fighting against the production design, but this is one where everyone just seemed to be on the same page.
Yeah, I'll just build off of what you said, because I agree with you 1,000%. The privateer ship is almost unique among Doctor Who spaceships in that it's shot on different levels. The only other example that I can think of before Warriors Gate is David Maloney, who's another top-tier Doctor Who director in Planet of Evil. Now, the spaceship in Planet of Evil is visually static, and it's not the best because they put all their money in the jungle set at Ealing for Planet of Evil. But you have two levels, people going up and down for Planet of Evil. So Warriors Gate is the same thing. The privateer ship is on levels. You have different characters doing different things at different stations at different heights. And then you have the two Rosencrantz and Guildenstern guys, Aldo and Royce, who are sitting down on the storage level, which is even further below. It's one of the few spaceships that is actually a lived-in world, as opposed to just, this is what a spaceship set is supposed to look like.
I was going to say, and the model of the spaceships, no, I like the design, that kind of black model they have of it, where it's just like, it's a slightly unusual shape, like, always makes me think a little bit of a duck. I don't know why, but it's just, again, it's an unusual shape among spaceship designs. It's not necessarily aerodynamic, but of course, this is the thing, spaceships actually in space do not have to be aerodynamic.
Right. And that, of course, becomes a plot point because you have the ship is constructed out of dwarf star alloy, so you need massive engines, and that's what ends up triggering the jeopardy in parts 3 and 4.
Yes, and it looks heavy. The model looks heavy, which is always a good trick to pull off.
And then, you and I are I think, very similar in age. We may be the last generation that grew up speaking black and white, because obviously by the time I'm starting to watch TV, everything is now being made in color in the States. But I grew up in my childhood bedroom with a 13-inch black and white TV. So all the formative television moments of my childhood, and this is between 1979 and 1984, which is how long I had that TV, everything important that I saw on my TV set was in black and white. I was watching the Baseball World Series in black and white. I was watching the New York Islanders win 4 consecutive Stanley Cup titles in black and white. I was watching my cartoons in black and white. I was watching Square Pegs, the American sitcom, in black and white. So I speak black and white. Now, my kid, who's practically a teen at this point, she just had to read Lord of the Flies for school. And we were discussing it, and I wanted to show her one of the Lord of the Flies movies, but there's a choice of 2. There's the 1990 version that came out when I was in high school, and then there's the 1963 version, which is part of the Criterion collection. Both of them are available on streaming, and I said, which one do you want to watch? So she chooses the 1990 one because it's in color. She doesn't speak black and white. It's not part of her visual language. Nowadays, black and white is associated with movies that your grandparents watch, so it doesn't work for her. So she wanted to watch the 1990 version of Lord of the Flies, which is much, much worse than the 1963 version. So she made the wrong choice, but for her, it had to be in color. Then, just to talk about a show that I talk about almost as much as The Dominators, let's talk about Better Call Saul. That is a series that takes place over multiple timelines, but you know when you're in the future, because in Better Call Saul, the future is always in black and white. So Warrior's Gate almost does the same trick 35 years earlier, right? When you're in End Space, you're in color. When you're in the Void, it's monochrome. You're just a white void. And when you're in E-Space, you're at Powys Castle, which is black and white. So that's, again, Paul Joyce thinking outside of the box. And then Better Call Saul comes along 35 years later and does an entire half season in black and white because that was their visual code for this is the future. It's not in color anymore. So another great thing to praise Paul Joyce for. And, of course, he was so good at it that he was banned from working on the show ever again.
I believe Vince Gilligan is a big Warriors Gate fan, so it's
wouldn't surprise me.
But yeah, it is a visual language that we hadn't really seen in Doctor Who up to this point. But now it probably wouldn't surprise as much because it was interesting what you're saying about black and white. I presume, do kids still understand black and white as? I mean, Better Call Saul is flash forward. Is it flash forwards or the present? Depending on how you look at it. But I understand black and white. If I see black and white in the show from the 90s, for example, they're showing a flashback. That's the idea. I'm just curious if that's still like, do people still associate black and white? Oh, this must be a flashback, or flash forward in the case of Better Call Saul. But it's interesting, because TV literacy is we're very visual culture, and I think it's changing all the time. It's changing at a rapid rate. What we associate with what.
And along the same lines, before J.J. Abrams was given the keys to the Star Wars and the Star Trek franchises, and we could of course have a whole separate debate as to whether or not that was a good idea. But did they have a UK show his very first TV series, Felicity, which was made in the late 90s?
I don't think so. I have heard about it since, but I don't remember it ever being shown here. If it was, it wouldn't have been on one of the terrestrial channels. It's
a straight up nighttime soap. It's about an American high school student from California who goes to college in New York at age 18 because she's following this boy that she has a crush on who barely knows she exists. And during the 4 years of the series, she's living in New York City. She's going to what's supposed to be NYU, which takes place in the Village in Manhattan, not too far from where I work. And she's finding herself. J.J. Abrams already at that point was a huge sci-fi fan, and I believe Felicity, if not the first, it's one of the very first television series to mention Doctor Who as an existing property. That would happen a lot more once the new series came around, but Felicity was talking about Doctor Who in the 1990s, which nobody else was doing. So there's one episode of Felicity that is an open homage to the Twilight Zone. So there's one episode that was shot in black and white, and it was given Twilight Zone-like on-screen titles. So J.J. Abrams takes this nighttime soap, and for 1 week only, he makes a black and white Twilight Zone episode, which turns out to be a nightmarish dream sequence. So that's an example of innovative use of black and white here in the States within our living memory. Possibly influenced by Warriors Gate. I imagine that J.J. Abrams might well have seen it if he was a Doctor Who fan. But of course, it's more Twilight Zone than Doctor Who. But if you watch Felicity long enough, which I do not recommend, you will hear Doctor Who mentioned sooner or later.
I will watch most things long enough if they mention Doctor Who at some point. So
So that's Warriors Gate on TV. Let's segue then to the book. So I'll preface, of course, by saying that we are talking about the 1982 novelization credited to John Lydecker, who was, of course, a pseudonym for Stephen Gallagher. This was not his original manuscript. JNT was just starting to take over the target line by force of will. So he nixed the original draft, because the original draft was based on the story that Gallagher submitted and not the final version that Gallagher and Bidmead wrote or co-wrote. And it doesn't contain a lot of the final TV product. So the original draft was nixed, and it ended up getting revived, and it was an audio. And now the print version of the audio is coming out later this year as part of the revived Target imprint. So you might have heard the John Culshaw narration of Gallagher's original manuscript, and in a few months you'll be able to read the original manuscript. This is the revised manuscript that he had to write to keep in line with what aired on television. But even then, there are some significant differences from the TV. So this is it's not exactly a transcript of Warriors Gate on television. It is, while not quite as a radical departure as what's going to be coming out later this year, in 2023. This is a different version of the story, and it's one of the first Target books since the days of Malcolm Hulke that almost jettisons the original story and goes off on its own. Wouldn't you agree?
yes, yeah, it wasn't as far as removed as I thought it might be, but like you said, there were definite changes. I mean, the most obvious being the beginning, that it has like essentially a prologue where we see the privateer. Essentially, we learn how it was damaged and how it ended. The crew ended up in the void, and through that, we get a little bit more of a sense of what they come from. Because interestingly enough, I always thought that their slave trading that they were doing was essentially legal, but this kind of hints that it's not. There's a lot of talk about black market, and they have to run a blockade, so it slightly shifts that.
And one thing we don't know is the Antonine killer. Is he a Tharal because he's mentioned as a cub? Is he a Tharal, or is he from some other alien species entirely that we never get to meet? Never mentioned on screen.
I read it as a Tharal because, like I said, cub, and it talks about paws. So to me, it would make sense that he's a Tharal. But yeah, that's never confirmed. Yeah, no, I was thinking about it. I don't think he's described beyond what he thinks about himself. There's never an outside description of him.
And he's also trying to destroy the privateer, which has hundreds of Tharals on board, which would be a point against him not being a Tharal. But I guess I don't have the answer to that without asking Stephen Gallagher himself, which I utterly failed to do at Galley last year. That should have been my first question. What is the Antonine?
Yeah, I always just presumed it was, even with the killing. Because I wondered like you, I wondered about the killing of the Thals, but I thought maybe there's a sense of better dead than slaves. But it's vague because there's talk of a blockade, but it's never clear if it's just the one species doing the blockade, or it's a collection, or quite what the background is here.
Something else that I love about the book, and again, I'm going to go into this in much more detail. I've already written my script for the back half of this program, which, as we're talking on Thursday afternoon, I have not recorded yet. So what Gallagher does that's interesting is he takes a lot of the long, silent, visual passages on TV, and he converts it into prose, and he offers a lot of written explanations in the book for things that are never explained or are only implied on television. I think it's a fascinating way to write. So rather than doing a transcript of Paul Joyce's shooting script, he is telling a different story almost, because he's giving you context for things that you never would have guessed from watching the television. So it's almost hard science fiction, whereas the TV is much more lyrical. So that's why I made the point about it being nearly a different story. Did you have the same experience reading this? You know, finding explanations for things on television that you didn't realize needed explaining?
Yeah, there was some interesting moments. It's little things like the Doctor, when he gets hit by the time winds, he talks about his hand getting old, and I'm not sure if that was something that was in the script originally or something that he added, because obviously the Doctor hand is injured, but this indicates that it's aging him, which feels almost appropriate for Series 18 when you consider what, you know, a few stories earlier he was aged in the Leisure Hive, and, you know, a couple of stories from this he's going to be regenerating. Felt thematically appropriate to a lot of what Series 18 does. I think, oddly enough, the bit that really sticks with me is the Gundam at the end, where it comes out the mirror and it looks like it's going to attack, but then he has this lovely little line about it. I can't quite remember how it goes, but he talks about how it wasn't built to think, or to think too deeply, because then it would have to consider how horrible its actions were, but it had been there to, you know, free the slaves from the masters. But who were the slaves now? Who were you know, these people in chains that were in front of it? So it just chooses to walk by, and I really like that. We don't see that. Nothing like that happens on screen. There's nothing equivalent of that. We just see the Thals leave the ship, and, you know, then they're fine. But it really caught my attention. This one, I thought it was a beautiful little moment.
Yeah, I have flagged that, and I'll be reading out as a 3-paragraph section later on in this program. So definitely stay tuned for that. But I think we get a lot more in the book about where the Gundams come from and how they operate. On TV, they're a visual device because they have the skull-like faces. And, of course, they show up for that remarkable Part 3 cliffhanger. But the book gets us a little further inside their circuitry and helps them understood a little better, I think.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And what's also interesting is that there's a real emphasis on how damaged K9 is, in a way, which I know is kind of, we see on the script, but here it's very much like they essentially go, oh, no, he's dying. I mean, they don't use those words, but there's a real emphasis on things crumbling in him and what exactly has gone wrong, and how it's interesting that there's very much a sense of, if he goes through the mirror, he'll never be able to come back, which it's kind of it's very sad in a way. In a sad way, it happens so quickly on the TV, partly because everyone in the production hated K9 and wanted to get him off as quickly as possible. So they're like, oh, he's going by. And here it's a bit more of an emphasis of how damaged he is and how sad the Doctor is. Like, there's a line at the end, how he's not just part of the TARDIS machinery, you know, but here he is essentially dying. It was.
There is this great passage, which I am not reading out later in the program. I would encourage you to seek it out. The last few pages of the book. The Doctor briefly thinks about rebuilding K9 because this model is effectively dead. But even if you rebuild him, you're not going to be able to duplicate K9's personality. So he's basically writing off K9. There's no way to go back and create the same K9 over again, which is why he gives K9 to Romana, where K9 can be restored on the other side of the mirror, which is exactly what happens in the end. Page 121 is the passage that I'm talking about. Well worth a read if you haven't read the whole book yet.
Yeah, definitely. What was interesting for me is a lot of the scripts because obviously, you know, Gallagher has talked about how much the script was changed. A lot of at least a lot of the lines that I recognise are in there. Doesn't have one of my favourite all-time Doctor lines though, which is, "We'll burn that bridge when we come to it." I was quite disappointed that wasn't there, because It's always been a favourite. But it's not in there. And we get, you know, it's nice. We get a fair amount from Romana's viewpoint as well, though. Again, her leaving's quite sudden, but it is in the TV show as well. I'd be interested if the revised version, if he builds up to it a bit more, because there's kind of like at the beginning she's like, Gallifrey's mentioned and stuff, but at the end she just goes, no, I don't want to go back actually. I'm going to make sure the Thals are... Actually, there is an interesting line which he's like, I'm basically going to make sure the Thals don't start trying to be slavers again.
Which is
And
very different from the TV dialogue
yeah.
of the exact same scene, which I'm going to be playing later on in the program. And I'll talk about this too later on. If you look at the original scripts on the Blu-ray, Romana doesn't leave in the original script. This was written before they knew when Lalla Ward was exiting the show. So that last line, she'll be superb, that's the last line of the TV story, but it refers to Byrock and not to Romana. Or Byrrock, I should say.
Oh, that's interesting. I think it probably works better for Romana. But
the line works much better for Romana.
It's... I mean, in some ways, I always say with Romana leaving, I like it when Doctor Who companions go off to like do something interesting, you know. So her going off to help the Thals, make sure they stay free, basically maybe be the Doctor for E-Space essentially. I like that, you know. When the companions go back to the normal lives on Earth, I'm like, no, why would you do that? So. And it's one of my great frustrations with Doctor Who's spin-off that, you know, there's this whole thing of like Romana's like, I don't want to go back to Gallifrey, I want to explore, blah blah. It's great, and fans go, brilliant, you're now president of Gallifrey, and it's like, wait, what? No, that doesn't make any sense with what we see on. Okay, she's president of Gallifrey, fine.
Although, to be fair, that comes from the New Adventures and the Eighth Doctor Adventures, which I want to talk about in a minute because that dovetails beautifully with your other podcast. But it's funny that Stephen Gallagher writes two stories for Doctor Who, okay? He does a Tom Baker story in season 18, right? And then he does a Peter Davison story in season 20. Both of those stories end with a female companion leaving to take on the role of the Doctor in rescuing this benighted civilization. So Romana stays behind to work with the Tharals and get them out of slavery. As Byrrock says at the end of the TV, we are enslaved on many worlds. And then in Terminus, Nyssa stays behind to work with the Vanir and help them cure Lazarus disease properly, because they have been subservient to this horribly inefficient corporation which cares entirely for profit and not for healthcare, which sitting here in America in 2021 is an incredibly raw and open wound. And Stephen Gallagher got there first, and then Eric Sayward ruined it by producing the story the way he did. But you can almost put Romana and Nyssa in the exact same boat. It's almost the exact same departure.
Yeah, and I guess it's an effective one. I mean, again, I'm not a huge fan of Terminus, but I do like that leaving scene that Nyssa has. I like the reason she's leaving. She's basically going, I have proper medical training. You know, it calls back to her origin. She's like, I'm actually a highly intelligent, highly trained, was it biochemist or something? I can make a difference here in the way that the Doctor couldn't, because I am happy to stay. And you know, it's one of those wonderfully underacted moments that Davison does, where where he says goodbye to her, and he's very much like kiss on the cheek, which is quite radical for his Doctor.
Oh, absolutely.
But you know, he's very much like a trapped in a glass box of emotion, to quote Anchorman. You can tell he's like quite upset, and then you get, you know, the scene between her and Tiga. Tiga's upset. It's actually a very good companion leaving scene, and I like the reason she leaves. But it's interesting what you point out. I hadn't considered that he actually writes two companions leaving. I guess there is that similarity. But like I said, for me, it's a good way for a companion to go. Actually, I can make a difference here, I'm going to stay, is one of my favorite cliches of companions leaving, I guess. Right. I'd rather that than they die, to be honest.
Well, Terminus is not coming up on this show for about 3 months. That novelization comes off a little bit down the road, and I'm only doing a book a week. But the novelization of Terminus, I think, will also make clear the story that is produced is not the story that Stephen Gallagher wanted to tell. And the story that Stephen Gallagher wanted to tell is much better preserved in the novelization, which has none of the many flaws of Terminus, the TV episode. So I'm going to have a different guest on for that, but I think you'll find when you listen to that in about 3 months, we'll be touching on a lot of the same points with regard to the original script versus the TV production. The problem is that the person who directed Terminus was not Paul Joyce and did not put in the same really amount of effort or flair that Paul Joyce did. Now, if Paul Joyce had done Terminus, we might all be talking about Terminus in very different tones.
Yes, I guess that's true. Or an older, more experienced JNT might have fried him and not let him back on at all. He comes out.
So coming back to Romana, so Terrence Dix writes a new adventure, and I don't know if this is one of the ones that you covered on your show. We'll talk about that in a minute. He writes Blood Harvest in July 1994. It is a sequel to the story that we discussed last week on this show, State of Decay, with Denise Sutton as my guest. Blood Harvest kicks open a whole new line in the NA's/Eighth Doctor adventures, where Romana does come back to Gallifrey and helps put down a revolution there and ends up becoming president again, except in the Eighth Doctor adventures, Romana regenerates, and Romana 3 is visually based on the old American silent film actress Louise Brooks, and this Romana is a little bit more amoral, if not evil. So the Romana in the Eighth Doctor adventures does bad things to Gallifrey and comes to a sticky end during the Time War. Spoilers for a line of books that's 25 years old that is being covered on much better podcasts than this. But you are talking about the new adventures now on your show, and I know you mentioned it the last time you were here, but that was 9 months ago, and I have a slightly increased audience. Tell us about the show that you and Eric are doing and where you are with the new adventures right now.
All right. Well, we do a show called The Real McCoy, which, as its name might suggest, is an in-depth look at the Seventh Doctor era. So we have covered all the TV stories except for the TV movie. We'll do that after we finish with the new adventures, and we're covering we decided to cover a selection of the new adventures, so not all 60. Partly because I don't think I could persuade Eric to hold on for that long. But our last episode was out in November. That was Set Piece, and we are recording next month. We've had a little hiatus because Christmas and life, and I got COVID, and so it's been a bit of a. I'm okay now, but it's then work got busy, and so it's. I mean, Jason, I always say the fact you managed to produce a show a week of anything up to 2 hours is a miracle in Doctor Who podcasting, and something I admire greatly, because I can't. But yeah, we're recording next month. We should be recording one of the biggies, actually, Human Nature, and then we'll be doing a few more after that. We're basically trying to hit probably most of what you call the big hitters in the range, and one or two like smaller ones that I particularly like. So obviously we'll be doing Damaged Goods, and I've pretty much read everything we're going to do except Lung Barrow. I've oddly enough never read Lung Barrow, so that's going to be interesting. People will get to hear my kind of first time reaction to that. And
are you aware of the plot of Lung Barrow and which returning characters are in it? So it does dovetail into our conversation here a little bit.
Yes, no, I'm aware of the basic plot and everything. I don't think there'll be a lot to surprise me in it, but I'm still curious because oddly enough, we did look at. Well, actually, Eric couldn't do the episode, so I, with another guest of ours, John Deere, who does a very good Nigel Neal podcast, the Birdcast. I'd highly recommend. We looked at Time's Crucible, and I kind of hated it, which is odd because I remember reading it and liking it, but I found it a real drag. And we've read books since that are probably technically worse, but don't drag as much as that did. So I'm like, how am I going to feel when I get to Lung Barrow? But we'll see. And then after that, we'll do some, again, maybe a handful of the new adventure. A handful of the big finishes. Neither of us are particularly big finish people. There's a few I want to cover, but I physically cannot afford to buy all of the Seventh Doctor new big finishes. So that's it. But yeah, basically, so. We're looking. It's an absolute. The McCoy era is my all-time. It's like my era in many ways, and so it's just a lovely chance to go in depth on an era I love and talk about two anarchists who like going around blowing stuff up. Really.
And the new adventures are my Doctor Who. As much as I love season 18, and my all-time favorite classic series story is coming up on this show in about 5 or 6 weeks. As much as I am a classic series guy, and as much as the black and white portion of the classic series is almost my favorite era of the show, especially the Hartnells, New Adventures came out when I turned 18. I started reading them as a freshman in college. They took me up until my second to last year of law school, which is when the Seventh Doctor regenerated and they lost the license, and the Doctor transferred over to the BBC books, leaving behind a series of Doctorless New Adventures starring a different character, which I largely have not read. But the New Adventures and I came of age together, and that was back then. It was the center of gravity for Doctor Who fandom because it was the only, not counting the DWM comic strips, it was the only ongoing story in Doctor Who. So all of us on Records Doctor Who, it was one book a month, and we were discussing the books as they came out, and there were polls and there were reviews, and we had some of the authors joining us on Records Doctor Who to discuss their books or other authors in the same range. It was an incredible time for fandom because we were all there watching these books get created, and a lot of fans ended up becoming first-time authors. You have all these people in their 20s writing full-length Doctor Who novels for the first time, and as I've said before, Doctor Who is at its best when it's being made by radical young people in their 20s, like Stephen Gallagher, who's 27, like Verity Lambert, who's about 27 when she starts producing the show, like I imagine Paul Joyce as the director. I haven't looked up his age, but I would assume he was in his late 20s, if not early 30s. So Doctor Who is best when young people are creating and doing whatever they want, and that's what the New Adventures were. And again, some of the books are better than others. You know, the expression goes, a person is smart, people are stupid. Some of the NAs don't work, but as a whole, they are much, much greater than the sum of their parts because of what they were doing and when they were doing it, and what these authors went on to do later in their careers between the Cornells and the Lance Parkins, and especially Russell T Davies, who wrote one of the most highly regarded New Adventures. So I just envy you guys on your journey, and I listened to your set piece recently, so I'm looking forward to following along to see where you go next.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I have really enjoyed revisiting them. I think partly because, when I started really being like a Doctor Who fan, instead of just someone mildly interested in the show, they were still around, and they hadn't quite come to an end yet, so you could still pick a look up in the bookshop. So for me, it was very much, I was the right age, 14, 15, so I was absolutely peak audience for it. And they were quite formative for me. And I think it's one of those. It is one of those periods of two spin-offs that I think almost needed to happen. Because they push the shows in all sorts of ways that wouldn't have happened before and wouldn't happen now. But it's all right for them to have done it because, to be honest, not enough people were reading it for it to distort the public's view of Doctor Who for all time. Obviously, like I said, we're doing Human Nature next, which is like the biggie from the range. It's only one of two that have been reissued. I think that's and Shakedown. Weirdly enough, Shakedown got reissued.
That's because it's a Terrence Dicks probably, rather than because it was on its own a great book.
Yeah, and
his name still moves copies.
And it had the Sontarans in it, so I think it was part of like they were doing a monster range, and I was like, really, Shakedown? And obviously Human Nature, and obviously it's been adapted for the TV, so it's going to be. I haven't reread it for quite a while, so I'm curious. There are a lot of differences between the book and the TV version. My memory is that the book is slightly more radical, as you would expect, but that's going to be really interesting to compare and contrast, I think.
Yeah,
but we're not doing Shakedown. We're not doing Shakedown, though.
I was going to say, Human Nature was written by an author who at the time identified as an atheist in his 20s, and it's got a very socialistic worldview. And I mean that in the positive sense. It is a book written from an anti-war standpoint, and one of the characters in the book is a practicing socialist. By the time you get to the TV production 15 years later, the author is coming from a very, very different place in life, and the politics of the story are changed quite a bit. And of course, we can also assume that Russell T Davies had done a rewrite of the Cornell script, which I think he was doing to everything. So while they share a similar plot style, very, very different animals, the book and the TV.
Yeah, it's going to, like I said, I don't think I've read it for a few years, reread it rather, I should say, for a few years now. So it's going to be a very interesting, reread for me. Really looking forward to it, actually.
So other than The Real McCoy, any other podcasts or anything else you want to promote?
I also do one called Harry Sullivan is an Imbecile with my friend Brian. We had a couple of episodes out last year after a bit of a gap, and we should hopefully have a few more out this year. It's a bit more random than Real McCoy. We kind of just tackle subjects that we feel like. So we talked a bit about the Matt Smith 11th Doctor as opposed to David Tennant's 11th Doctor. The 11th Doctor comics from Titan, it's always been a personal favourite of mine, and we both love Harry Sullivan deeply, so that's been a topic of conversation in the past as well. So yeah, that's my two major projects at the moment: the Real McCoy and Harry Sullivan is an imbecile.
Speaking of major projects, you got time for a game of 20 questions?
I'll give it a go.
There's the attitude. I am one random Doctor Who story from anywhere between 1963 and 2022. I am selected at random from the randomizer.net, which is a production of the Flight Through Entirety podcast. You are going to guess with 20 yes or no questions which story I am, starting with question number 1.
Okay. Was it made in the 20th century?
No, I am not a story made in the 20th century. Question 2.
Okay. Were you made under RTD as a showrunner?
Yes, I was. I am an RTD showrun story. Question 3.
Is Rose the companion?
No, Rose is not the companion. So you're 1 for 3, but you've narrowed it down pretty well. Question 4.
Is Martha the companion?
Yes, she is. Which is funny because we were just talking about her in another context. Question 5.
So just because there are ways that I could caught out on this, are you a Series 3 story?
Yes, I am a Series 3 story. Question 6.
Are you set in the past?
That's a technical question, but yes, I am set in the past.
Are you the Shakespeare Code?
No, I am not the Shakespeare Code.
Are you human nature?
No, that would have been amazing if I was, because we just talked about it. But no, I am not human. I am from the same season as human nature, but I am not human nature.
Okay.
I think we're at question 9.
Are you the Daleks in Manhattan?
No, I do not want to be the Daleks in Manhattan for many reasons. No, I am not the Daleks in Manhattan.
Oh God.
I inadvertently gave the game away before when I said that I was a technicality, and I'm giving you this hint because there are now more questions left than stories remaining in New Series 3. But when I said I was set in the past in a technical sense, that might give you a little bit of a clue. Especially because there aren't too many other choices.
No. Are you Blink?
Yes, I am Blink, because part of me takes place in the 1920s and part of me takes place in 1969.
I'm glad I got it, but imagine if it'd been human nature. That would just, everything would have synced perfectly. But
that would have been hilarious. Actually, the very first choice that I got was a Hartnell that I've already covered on this show before, so this is the second choice, but we have not done Blink yet, and it's always worth talking about Blink, which, by the way, shares a cast member in common with Planet of Evil, making this an episode that is now referred to Planet of Evil twice.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? I always forget there's actually quite a small little interesting little body of new Who actors who appeared in old Who, like Linda Barron, because old enough I was listening to people talking about Enlightenment earlier, and Captain Rack. Yeah, that's good. I can't remember how many questions I took last time I did this, so I'm just going to presume I've about the same number.
I really need to hire an intern to go back and categorize the show and figure out which 20 questions I've done and which episodes and how many people have gotten it and how many questions. I know that Conrad is the reigning king because he got it in 6, and Pete Lambert is the co-king with an asterisk. So if Conrad is number 1, Pete Lambert is 1A. So you are not one of the winners yet, but maybe next time you'll get it in more than maybe you'll get it in less than Conrad next time. We'll see.
Okay, well, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Where else can we find you on the web apart from the 2 podcasts you just mentioned?
You can find me on Twitter as long as it lasts, which may not be much longer. I'm not posting on there very often, but I am still on there at Adam J. Clegg. You can also follow the Real McCoy in there at real_pod. I'm also on Instagram, but I only occasionally post when I get a tattoo or a particularly good dog photo. And I cannot remember what my Instagram thing is. Give me a second. Okay, yeah, you can find me as Adam Clegg on there, or Fluid Link, which, yes, is the Doctor Who reference.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's pretty much it for me online at the moment.
All right, Adam, thanks so much. Stick around after we disconnect, and I will book another appearance for you. Have a great rest of the night. Thank you again.
Thank you. Been a real pleasure.
Doctor Who and Warrior's Gate. Written by Stephen Gallagher. Writing as John Lydecker. Televised as Warrior's Gate. Teleplay by Stephen Gallagher. Televised in January 1981. Published in April 1982. Cover artist Andrew Skilleter. The Doctor and his companions are trapped in an E-space universe, struggling to find the coordinates which will break the deadlock and take them back into normal space. When all else fails, the Doctor suggests programming the TARDIS on the toss of a coin. Before he realizes what is happening, that is just what Adric has done. When the TARDIS arrives at its destination, according to the console readouts, the craft is nowhere. And nowhere is exactly what it looks like. This book came out April 1982. April 15th, 1982, the most important day in the history of my fandom. My other fandom. Baseball fandom. That was the day I saw my first New York Mets baseball game in person. It was a Thursday afternoon game against the Philadelphia Phillies in the Flushing neighborhood in the borough of Queens on the sites of the 1964 and 1939 World's Fairs. And given that this is a literature podcast, I'll tell you that it's also the site of the Valley of Ashes, made famous in The Great Gatsby, although the Valley of Ashes was gone long before the New York Mets came to town. This was not a great day for the Metropolitans. They lost 8-4 in 13 innings. If you've been listening to this show for a while, this is where you're expecting me to drop in an audio clip from the game, but there aren't any. Most baseball games from this era, even more so than 1960s Doctor Who, no longer exist in video or audio. There wasn't even a This Week in Baseball episode that week that I can find online. Now, I do have audio from the April 17th and April 18th, 1982 games against the Montreal Expos, but the Mets ended up losing 97 games that year, so I won't torment you with the banality of 1982. Paul Scoons pointed out on Twitter, regarding last week's episode, State of Decay, that State of Decay was the first novelization he bought on its initial release. I had to think about that. I will not reach that point until 1985, but April 1982 is important, and not only for my increasingly tenuous baseball analogies. Warrior's Gate is only the fourth Target novelization published in the last 12 months, courtesy of the 1981 writer's strike, which kept Terrence Dicks away from the Target range for most of that year. And look at the cover of Warrior's Gate, another gorgeous Andrew Skilleter painting. Now look at it again. There's David Weston's face in Tharrell makeup, there's the Gateway Arch, the privateer ship taking off, and a deep blue and yellow color scheme with a hint of a spiral nebula. You know what's not on the cover? Tom Baker. It's a Fourth Doctor book without the Fourth Doctor. Why? Because it's April 1982. The previous book, State of Decay, came out in January 1982, the first month of season 19, Peter Davison's first season as the Fifth Doctor. But now, April 1982, producer John Nathan Turner's oversight of the Target books is getting real. No more past Doctors on the cover, and Tom Baker is now, for the first time since the very early days of the Target range, and we're now in season 5 of this podcast, so that's a long time, Tom Baker is no longer the current Doctor on TV. He is now, in fact, a past Doctor. J&T also famously nixed the original Stephen Gallagher draft of this book, which was based on Gallagher's original scripts. Those scripts were later heavily revised by Christopher H. Bidmead. Adam and I talked about this earlier. The original Gallagher draft of Warrior's Gate came out as an excellent audio, narrated by John Colshaw, and will soon be a new Target paperback in summer 2023, just a few months away. We'll be covering that new paperback on Trap 1, and then much later on in the life of this podcast. This week is solely about the 1982 release of Warrior's Gate, the moment when J&T had Tom Baker's face taken off the covers, with one later exception, and when J&T asked the book to be rewritten because it wasn't close enough to the TV. Gallagher, using the pen name John Lydecker for professional reasons, is also something very rare for this era of Target, a first-time author. Before this book, the last two first-time Target writers were David Fisher in 1981, and then Ian Marter with Ark in Space way back in 1977. That's only 3 first-time writers in 5 years. But from here on out, there will be a lot more first-time writers, 3 more to come in 1982 alone. So this book is fresh. It's only 124 pages of text, which is about the length of your standard Terrence, but there are also no chapters, and the first 5 pages are a prologue that features a not-on-TV character, depicting a space battle, of which the TV shows us only the aftermath. And then Gallagher punctuates the text with computer monitor readout text, always concluded with a sardonic observation offered by the computer to the privateer crew. We have literally never seen a Target book like this before. The Antonine Killer sequence, the last remnant from Gallagher's submitted novelization draft, is hard sci-fi, true hard sci-fi. The only comparison with a previous Target is the Robert Holmes penned prologue to The Time Warrior, but the Holmes prologue at least featured that TV story's villain. The Antonine Killer here, perhaps a Tharl, perhaps some other species bent on destroying slave ships, Adam and I are unsure, is never referenced on TV. Gallagher's second scene in the book is filtered through the eyes of Packard, the privateer's first officer, delightfully played by Kenneth Cope on TV. And this stuff is funny, workplace comedy, office space for a science fiction slave ship. The computer refers to the privateer crew as boobs, and Packard's observations are acerbic. Quote, Packard couldn't tell whether he, Captain Warwick, was being strong and silent, or if his mind had gone blank. Gone offline to sort and dump information. Or, Lane wasn't the fastest or the brightest, but he was the biggest, and that counted for a lot. Gallagher also offers prose explanations for concepts described only poetically on TV. Page 10, what is a time sensitive? Quote, time sensitivity was the Tharl's curse. From an infinite range of possible futures, they could select one, and visualize it in detail, as if it had already happened. Sometimes, in moments of extreme trance, their bodies would shimmer and glow, dancing between those possible futures, and only loosely anchored in the present. It took intense concentration to bring a Tharl back into phase with the moment, or chains. The heaviest chains would do the job just as efficiently. Again, hard sci-fi, a bracing change from our previous Target adaptations. Now compare pages 1 through 12 of the book with the first several minutes of the TV Part 1. There's almost no overlap. The privateer scene has almost entirely different dialogue, and Aldo and Royce, the 2 Greek chorus characters a la The Hidden Fortress, or a la a particular 1977 sci-fi movie shot at Pinewood and on location in Tunisia, are on TV, but don't show up in the book until much later. Gallagher also adds privateer crewmen Nestor and Jos, J-O-S, also not named on television. The first TARDIS scene is markedly different from the TV in terms of dialogue, and you can relax. I'll spend the rest of this essay taking it as read that the book, after the J&T requested rewrites, is still very different from the TV, and not doing a line-by-line comparison. Except to say that Gallagher, as Terrence the book before, doesn't get into who Adric is, or was Adric already dead in the TV chronology by April 1982, but does give us on page 14 a good view of the Doctor's psyche from Romana's view. Quote, Romana had seen this mood before. It came about when the doctor's own argumentative reserves were running low, so he turned the tables and take over his opponent's ideas, leaving nothing else for anyone else to go on. Watching it being done to someone else could be fun. Having it done to you, and not for the first time, was only tiresome. And this prefaces Romana's coming decision to leave throughout the Doctor. Gallagher focuses on what the discontinuity guide described as the, quote, banal villainy of the privateer crew. Lane's nose itches inside his space helmet, and he nearly injures himself trying to scratch it. The TV version has to add a line, absent from the book, explaining what the I Ching is. The book also explains why Birok leaves the ship so early on without rescuing his fellow Tharal slaves. Page 21 has one of the best takedowns of organized religion that you'll find in what's nominally a children's book. What do you think is the biggest common factor in the belief system of every developed culture? Basic ignorance? No. Faith. Same thing. There's a classical allusion to the gates of Troy, and Birok, it's said, might have been on the run from a fairy tale. This book is, in short, energizing. A mix of hard sci-fi, observational humor, workplace comedy, classical allusions, and poetic comparisons. Steve Gallagher was, by the way, only 27 when this came out. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Doctor Who works best when it's run by young radicals in their 20s. Of course, on TV, Birok says that he is, quote, the shadow of my past and of your future. That's not in the book. May have been a Bidmead line. Bidmead was also only 39 when he script edited season 18, and I was wrong before about Paul Joyce when talking to Adam. Wikipedia says he was between 36 and 40 when this was made. The Wikipedia bio author doesn't seem to know his exact year of birth. Still, from where I sit, even Bidmead and Joyce were babies. For another example, Gallagher at age 27 has a very firm handle on the Tom Baker Doctor. Last paragraph of page 35. Romana watched him go, knowing better than to do otherwise. Something she'd learned about the Doctor was that he never took orders, and that he very rarely even took notice. When the logic of a situation seemed to be making loud demands for caution, it was by no means unusual for the Doctor to take a leap into the dark if his intuition suggested that he should. Intuition, as he had often said, was to be valued far above logic, for logic could be designed into a machine by anybody with a basic knowledge of computer science, whilst intuition was solely the product of evolution. And, as he had also been known to assert, the Doctor had much greater respect for the architect of evolution than he had for the designers of what he had called Tinker Toy electronic brains. But enough about ChatGPT. Let's turn back to Warrior's Gate. Now, for comparison's sake, when I was 27, I hadn't even started my current career path. I knew nothing at age 27. Gallagher at age 27 is looking right into the future and telling us that AI is a terrible idea. Now, again, this is not going to be a line-by-line review. Suffice to say, there is something memorable on every page, but Gallagher dealing in firm sci-fi concepts, while maybe lacking the poetry of some of Bidmead's revision and all of Paul Joyce's transcendent direction, at least gives you the plot much earlier than the TV did, and in marvelous prose. Bottom of page 46, Birok stood in the gloom of the hall and looked on the lost glory of the Tharals. He knew that he was in the middle of a legend, but it was a legend of defeat, no more than an echo of the greatness that had preceded the enslavement of the race, the fall which had scattered them throughout 1,000 systems to live as land-grubbing beggars, while they waited for the hunters to drop from the sky. The extra clarity of the early prose does come at the expense of the last episode, which on TV is where much of the useful exposition usually comes in. The Part 1 material runs for 51 pages, about 42% of a 124-page book. That sort of percentage I can work out in my head from my knowledge of baseball batting averages, although I'll point out to you that the current state of baseball analytics has rendered batting average pretty much obsolete in favor of more advanced statistics. The Part 4 material in the book is just 25 pages. As I read these books one episode a night, you can understand why so much of the script so far has been dedicated to the Part 1 material. We've talked a lot on this show about the different prose styles of the best target writers. Terrence focuses on observational humor and razor-sharp interjections. Malcolm Hulke invents full-length character bios for tertiary characters that people remember better than the TV performances. Ian Marter narrates his fictional worlds through the five senses. And Stephen Gallagher, in keeping with this hard sci-fi bent, gives significance to props. In the first few pages of the Part 2 material, pages 52 through 54, he makes much of the heavy weight of Birok's manacles, a clue to what dwarf star alloy will soon do to the gateway. And he gives an in-universe explanation for Lane's portable mass detector. It measures cargo from outside the hold, so the crew doesn't have to go in. In fact, on page 62, Lane reflects that Rorvik, quote, probably valued the mass detector more than any individual member of the party. This is a lived-in world, and while I love the TV story to pieces, I also love this alternate take, which lacks Paul Joyce's visual poetry, but which fires the imagination. We'll see this again with Terminus, where the book far, far outweighs the TV. The book puts the TV scenes in several different orders, and doesn't introduce Aldo and Royce until page 62. Aldo and Royce are two of the best things about the TV. Well, there are many best things about the TV. They're the stories Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, a la Tom Stoppard, the two crewmen who don't care if dead Tharrells out of the cargo eat into the crew's bonus because they're on straight salary. Gallagher's Terminus being one of the other few Doctor Who TV scripts to impose real-world capital versus labor economy into its fictional universe. Their first book scene, Aldo and Royce, mirrors dialogue from City of Death, bottom of page 62. Royce says, quote, "It's not as complicated as it looks. Nothing," Aldo was thinking, "could be as complicated as this mess was looking." We learn that Sagan is a two-fingered typist, Gallagher's shorthand for the unskilled office worker not up to the privateer's more complex task of escaping the gateway void. More seriously, Gallagher narrates Romana's thought processes as she, the Doctor's Gallifreyan student intern, gives herself negative performance appraisals for having gotten herself quite literally tied down to the privateer's navigation station. The Part 2 material contains a lot more direct quotes from the TV dialogue than does Part 1, and this gives a better insight into which lines were written by Bidmead, most of Adric's and K9's scenes in the Void.
Well, I thought you went that way.
Mass detection circuits indicate maximum reading on current vector. Probability of error.
Well, what is the probability of error, K9?
Recomputing. Probability of error 87.7948%.
87? But that's terrible.
The accuracy of this unit has deteriorated below zero utility.
You mean you're worse than useless?
Affirmative.
And also Romana's computer lingo double talk, which I imagine came straight from Bidmead's day job.
I use a digitally modelled time cone isometry parallel bust into the image translator. Local motion is mapped in with each refresh cycle.
Never mind all that.
The no-chapter format of the novelization makes the cliffhangers a little hard to find. Part 1 ends in mid-paragraph at the bottom of page 51. Parts 2 and 3 end in mid-section on pages 76 and 100 respectively. The first few minutes of Part 3 on TV are incredible. Well, the whole story, incredible, but just take the small burst of scenes in microcosm. K9 trying unsuccessfully to teach the privateer crew something about physics. The Doctor on the far side of the mirror talking to Birok. The book contains these component scenes, albeit with different dialogue, while lacking the visual poetry of the TV. I may have said that earlier. The book does explain how the Doctor got through the mirror by touching it with his hand that had been scarred by the time winds. This journey is never explained or rationalized on TV. Something I've only just noticed is that the story seems to be a big influence on what Christopher H. Bidmead is going to do next. We're introduced to an impossible locale, and then in Part 3, that impossible locale starts collapsing in on itself, which is exactly how Bidmead is going to structure his coming scripts for Logopolis and then Castrovalva. The shrinking of the gateway, which is teased in Part 3 here, both on TV and on the corresponding book material, is not so different from the entropy that destroys Logopolis or the recursive occlusion that will destroy Castrovalva. That's 3 consecutive novelizations of TV stories that seem to have been a big influence on Bidmead's own writing. The many references to Unearthly Child and Logopolis, see episode 65, and the colony ship story in State of Decay, that is revisited after a fashion in Frontios, see episode 66. Something else Gallagher does here, by the way, that Bidmead will soon do in the Logopolis book, and boy am I excited for that episode, is to convert TV dialogue into inner monologue or prose. On TV, Romana explains to Adric about dwarf star alloy and why the privateer engines are so big. But in the book, she's by herself, and it's all shown through her thoughts. There's an actual explanation of what dwarf star alloy is, followed eventually on page 103 by the very poetic description, quote, the only substance dense enough to pin down a dream. Gallagher gets right into Romana's head on page 88. As much as I love Lalla Ward, it's unfair that this book, the second to last novelization to feature her, and her final story in TV order, check that, third to last, is the one that gets into her head best. Page 88. She sat on the floor, as far away from the water and the filth as she could get, and tried to think. Dwarf star metal, time sensitivity, K9's incomprehensible raving, all of the revelations and discoveries of the last few hours spun together in a cosmos where there was no beauty or sense. She was more than ever aware of the need to find the doctor, but now for the second time she found herself under restraint, and for the second time she really had only herself to blame. Now the job of contacting the doctor, wherever he might be, was left to Adric. Even though he was able, this was a burden that was neither fair nor particularly well starred. It was all looking very bleak. And on the bottom of page 89, Gallagher lays clear the real meaning of the Gateway Void, in a way the TV story does not. The TV story I love for the visuals, but the book, which offers tantalizing explanations of everything that Paul Joyce achieved with visual effects or editing, is also something I love. Page 89. Now Romana can see the void for what it was. Not a true emptiness, but the neutral ground, where all the alternate possibilities that made up her future were in a state of rest. Ahead was the gateway, far off but invisible no longer, and it seemed to her that behind the tumble-down ruin, so close that it would need only a firm belief to make it real, stood a structure that shone gold and magnificent. They seemed to be floating towards it. They were probably running, but Romana had no sensation of making any effort or fighting any resistance. And page 91, she'd had a glimpse of a kind of paradise, and nothing could ever quite be the same. You will miss some of the visual flourishes added for TV. The Doctor knocking over the goblet in the past in Part 3, that he later picks up in the present in Part 1, the way Lane and Romana circle each other in the privateer's hold, mirroring identical actions between Lane and Biroc in Part 1, and yeah, I just wanted to bring up Lane in this essay somehow, one of my favorite tertiary characters in the classic series. You could tell the story without him, and the new series would tell this kind of story without him, but why would you want to lose that performance? In the book, Romana and Laszlo have a long dialogue scene, full of inventive wordplay. All this is wordless on TV. Each version is good. On TV, of course, the banquet scene late in Part 3 is perfection. I know, that's not a very objective statement. Let's break it down. The dialogue between Biroc and the Doctor contains an expert's understanding of history, but the author is only 27 years old, or 39 if Bidmead wrote that. The TV visuals and time jumping and video editing are a great leap forward for Doctor Who's stylistic evolution. The cliffhanger is a terrific misdirection. You know what, let's listen to the audio. Of course, sadly, without the video, the audio is only the half of it, but it is still very, very, very good.
Such variety. Where did it all come from?
The universe is our garden.
Ah. So this is what it was all like.
At the height of our empire, before the Tharals became the slaves of men.
I notice you don't do too badly for staff. This garden of yours, the universe, how do you manage it?
We use our power. To those who travel on the time winds, the vastness of space is no obstacle. Everything is ours.
Including her.
They're only people.
So you're the masters the Gundam spoke of, The enslavers?
The weak enslave themselves, Doctor. You and I know that.
Yes. Yes. This is no way to run an empire.
Danger, the doctor's in danger. Doctor!
Well, Doctor, this is a surprise.
Page 107. Romana's alliterative statement about the backblast backlash is a little shorter and a little less alliterative in print, but it's still here. Honestly, I don't get why people dislike that line. And on page 108, Gallagher takes a moment from out of the climax to give a plaintive last word to the privateer's onboard computer sensors. Rec room coffee dispenser now inoperable. The machine prints out. The most minor in a long list of catastrophic disasters about to befall the privateer and her crew. An interesting point, and we can trace this now thanks to the various draft scripts included as bonus BD raw material on the Blu-rays, is that this was not scripted as Romana's departure story. All that stuff was worked in later, largely by Bidmead, I think. There's an incredible scene in Part 4, where Romana literally becomes the Doctor, by repeating everything he says, only better.
Right. Stop! If I'm not back for whatever reason in 13.5 minutes, I want you to dematerialize.
Without you?
I am not letting you go alone.
That's an order. It's about time you started accepting orders.
It is long past time, but how do you think you're going to find the cable?
With my eye.
Adric and I have seen it.
Good. Come on.
I'm coming too.
You are not. It's long past time you learned to obey orders. Now stay here, and if we are not back, for whatever reason, in 13.5 minutes, I want you to dematerialize. Do you understand?
I like that. I think you're improving.
It's a matter of complete indifference to me.
Indifference? 13.5 minutes.
I'm sure you will.
This TV scene, which I do not get tired of listening to, is in the book, although shorter, and with some dialogue reallocated. Much of the Part 4 material, all 25 pages of it, is like that. I assume the end result on TV owes much to Bidmead, and to Tom Baker and Lalla Ward in rehearsal. Last week, episode 66, State of Decay, I mentioned that Terrence missed an opportunity, with Romana imagining the Doctor's death, to tease the coming events of Logopolis. On page 113 here is a scene eerily similar to the Logopolis climax of the Pharaohs Project. The Doctor is shoved off a catwalk while trying to short out a cable, carrying a charge that could end the universe. But no teasing Logopolis here either. In the book, the cable is not supposed to be shorted out, and while Rorvik rants about getting something done, the theme of the episode is do nothing. And as Gallagher explains the disastrous consequence of the backblast on page 116, he does so with a sentence that could have come out of Logopolis, quote, "Matter is only energy locked down tight. Energy is matter set free." Page 117, by the way, almost predicts the end of Earthshock, which aired a month before the book came out, though the similarity is almost entirely coincidental, I'm sure. Of Adric, Gallagher writes, perhaps one day he'd understand the pointlessness of dying alongside them, but that day was far away. In April 1982, not so much. Page 120 is a remarkable meditation on the last of the Gundans, and why it gives up its mission to kill the brutes who rule. Adam mentioned it earlier. I'll give you the full text. It's difficult to imagine the workings of the Gundans' dark soul. For an age it had waited, obedient to its prime command, to kill the brutes who rule. In some ways it was an uncomplicated soul, bent to a single purpose, but in order to operate independently in territory where its masters could never go, it needed a measure of analytical judgment. Not much. Never enough to allow it to reflect on its orders, just enough to let them carry it out, to seek out and punish the brutes who rule. And who were the rulers now? Who wore the chains? And who held the whips? Who ran? And who chased? The Gundan had pondered these issues as it walked alone through the abandoned gateway. Now it walked on past Birok, ignoring him. The last several pages of the book are like this, as one senses Gallagher rushing to finish within the limits of a page count, or perhaps a tight publisher deadline. Romana's departure, and the Doctor's mathematical solution for finding the CVE and the gateway so he can go home is all delivered in prose rather than dialogue. The last 5 minutes of the TV story, darn it, make me emotional. The book almost captures that, but the TV dialogue, while spare, and not especially given over to characters talking about how much they'll miss one another, in other words, the complete opposite of any RTD-era companion departure, ends in the Doctor's valedictory that Romana will be superb. The BD-ROM shows us the original ending, where Romana remained in the TARDIS and it was Bierok off to free his people who would be superb. The line works much better this way, and you can see why Bidmead kept it. On TV, we learn that Bierok needs a TARDIS to free his people from many worlds. K9 can build a TARDIS from the schedules in his memory, and Romana can fly it. The book doesn't give us any of that. The line about superb is relegated to the Doctor's inner thoughts, and none of his and Romana's final dialogue appears on TV. While the TV version is stronger, for me at least, the last paragraph of the book still manages to tug at my heartstrings. K9 stayed a little longer. His senses were more acute, and the traces of the TARDIS took longer to fade. But after a while he wheeled around and started down the path behind the Tharrel and his mistress. Lalla Ward was the noblest Romana of them all, but I'm going to miss K9 just as much, even if he is going to be in 5 more original Target novelizations after this one.
Quick, inside. What's the matter?
I'm not coming with you.
Inside, that's an order!
No more orders, Doctor. Goodbye.
What? Well, what a moment to choose!
But it is, isn't it? A moment to choose. I've got to be my own Romana.
And we need a Time Lord.
Goodbye, Doctor.
No, wait, there's something else. K9, he'll be all right with you behind the mirrors.
I'll take care of him.
I'll miss you. You were the noblest Romana of them all.
The TARDIS. Gone.
TARDIS preserved in concept, Mistress. This unit contains all necessary schedules for duplication of the TARDIS, Mistress.
Exactly, K9. Bierok will help us use the gateway to travel anywhere in E-space, and we can give him time technology.
You shall be our Time Lord, and we will travel far. Our people are enslaved on many planets.
And you and I, K9, are going to help Bierok free them. That's something we've got to do, don't you think?
Affirmative, Mistress.
Will Romana be all right?
All right. She'll be superb.
Next time on Doctor Who Literature, an audio essay that is going to be a lot shorter than this one, I promise, but it is no less one of my TV favorites. It is the 3rd consecutive Season 18 novelization, and it is in fact the 3rd consecutive novelization published in story order, something we very rarely see in the Target line. We're going to meet a new companion, we're going to meet an old enemy, we're going to meet a new friend who becomes an old enemy, and here on Doctor Who Literature I'm going to be joined by another Target Novelizations podcaster. You've heard him on the show before. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about one of my favorite TV episodes, and for that corresponding reason, one of my favorite books, even if it is a Terrence Dicks job and not quite as lyrical or hard sci-fi as Warrior's Gate. So join us next week for Doctor Who and the Keeper of Traken. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Special thanks to my special guest, Adam Clegg of the Real McCoy Podcast. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.